It is a Batman shirt.
I thought this morning that,
Yeah, look
he's got a Batman shirt on.
Really? We're
I'm looking at it right now, I'm going,
Yeah.
is that a Batman? Oh, now, you know what I was doing? I was looking at the yellow right now.
Oh, okay.
I wasn't looking at the black. Whoa. No, I clearly saw a Batman shirt this morning. Now I just see these bumps.
Isn't that funny? I see the yellow, but I know that that's the Batman shirt. You know what I'm saying? Isn't that weird?
I know,
Your
It's
kids
all
think
right.
you're cool because you have a Batman shirt.
Right, I don't. It's just a shirt that I
Probably
picked
not.
out. I had no idea that I was going to get prayed over today. So.
Your wife looked all nice.
Right, like she's wearing a dress. I'm up there with my T-shirt.
You know, I just figured you'd just come off duty.
No,
So just tell people that.
just
No, you just look like a comfortable MCFer, that's all.
yeah. Does anybody have any questions before we get started? Anything at all? Pretty clear last time.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
just a lot of stuff, but we went over it pretty quick. But it's not that hard. It's just Bible study, pretty much. Today we're going to be talking about the reliability of the New Testament. Let me get my Bible.
Sorry, I gotta turn it
Okay, so how inaccurate is this book? How inaccurate is the Bible? It is so inaccurate that when archaeologists are digging in the Middle East, they refer to it for information. They rely on it for information. No, actually, this book has never been shown to be inaccurate, despite what the criticisms that it receives from scholarship and from popular media. Archaeological discoveries have pretty much annihilated the legendary hypothesis of the Bible, meaning someone much later, after the events occurred, made up the stories because we now have archaeological proof that many of the characters and places in the Bible actually existed. Today, we're going to discuss the topic of textual criticism and how scholars view the New Testament. We're also going to discuss the concept of the Bible being inerrant, and what that actually means. We're going to discuss several things which has challenged my own personal beliefs, probably more than any other topic I've looked into. So just to warn you, you might hear things that may at first make you feel uncomfortable, but in the end, I promise it has a happy ending. So we're going to mainly focus on the Gospels, but the earliest writings of the New Testament is going to be considered to be Paul's letters. Paul was converted around AD 33. Some scholars argue that Paul was possibly converted as late as AD 36. That's the latest I've ever heard. We know from Galatians that Paul waited 3 years before going to Jerusalem and spent 15 days with Peter and James, the brother of Jesus.
That was too
Okay, sorry.
fast. This will be on what you send us.
Yeah, but if you want to write it down, go ahead. Sometimes people learn better by taking notes, so that's fine.
Charity Chick says
Hello, Jerry Chick. Okay. So, historians also believe in the mid-AD 60s, Paul was executed in Rome. So most historians believe Paul's letters were written around the AD 50s. Now let's take a look at the Gospels. Before the 18th century, which I hope sounds familiar to you, remember that was the beginning of the Enlightenment period, when scholars started becoming skeptical about everything that's been done before. So, before the 18th century, Matthew was considered the first written gospel. However, that concept began to be challenged, and it was concluded that Mark was the first written gospel.
Is that still the accepted?
Yeah, they still believe that Mark is the first written gospel. Now, why did they conclude this? Well, scholars began comparing all the synoptic gospels. What are the synoptic gospels? It's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Synoptic comes from the Latin word synopticus, and that word comes from the Greek word synoptikos. Is that right? It means seeing all together, a synopsis. So these Gospels gave an account from a similar point of view. John's the outcast gospel among scholars. We'll get into that further. Anyway, they compared the synoptic gospels, and it was concluded that Matthew, when they looked at it and compared them, Matthew frequently agreed with Mark against Luke. In the order of passages, Luke frequently agreed with Mark against Matthew. Matthew and Luke rarely agreed with each other against Mark. So because of all that, Mark was concluded as the priority gospel, meaning Matthew and Luke used Mark as a source for their accounts. That's what they concluded. Is this absolutely certain? No. There's actually scholars that are starting to argue against the marking priority, but I'm just sharing with you the information and what has been concluded thus far. Is it absolutely right? I'm not a New Testament scholar. This is just what they're saying, and people are starting to argue against it. See, then Matthew and Luke were written independently of each other around the same time. Now there are occasions where Matthew and Luke agree with each other, and it's not written in the Mark account because it is concluded that these accounts are written independently of each other, meaning they did not use each other as a source, and they both wrote the same event, but that event is not found in the Mark account. It is concluded they must have used another source besides Mark. That source is called, this is all this, the Q source. That source is called the Q source, or the Q saying source. Scholars date the Q source even prior than Mark. In fact, the Q source is considered to be even before Paul's letters. Q is believed to be a written collection of primarily Jesus' sayings, or it's considered to be a collection of both written and oral sayings. Is there any empirical evidence for Q? No. There's zero empirical evidence of Q. We have absolutely no manuscripts of this Q source. It's purely hypothetical. I'm not a big believer in the Q source myself. Like I said, I'm not a New Testament scholar, but there are several New Testament scholars that also are skeptical towards the Q source. The first time I heard this in college, I was like, whatever. So, anyway, finally there's John. John is considered a completely different source. The order of events that are written in John are different than in the Synoptic Gospels. It adds several events which are not written in the Synoptic Gospels, and is the least simplistic. So John is considered the last written gospel, and scholars try to date this account as late as they possibly can. In fact, before 1934, it was said that the Gospel of John could not have been written before AD 160. In 1844, there was a scholar by the name of F.C. Bauer, who was a professor in Germany. He argued that the New Testament took a long time to write, and he concluded that the book of John could not have possibly been written before AD 160. And for the next 90 years, the New Testament scholarship concluded that Bauer was right. Then, in 1934, 90 years later, there was a young doctoral student by the name of C.H. Roberts who went to Manchester University in England, and he inherited a shoebox full of papyri, and that has been recently excavated. As he was rummaging through the shoebox, he discovered a small scrap of papyrus, and based upon the writing, he knew that it was pretty early. But what really astounded him was that it was written on both sides. Now, manuscripts in that time were written on scrolls, so they would be written only on the inside of the manuscript. So this manuscript was written on a codex. Okay, so this is a codex. It's a book. So the manuscript was written on a codex. The codex was written in the second half of the first century. For the first 500 years of Christianity, Christians absolutely loved the codex book form. 80% of all Christian manuscripts were written on a codex form for the first 500 years, while only 20% of all non-Christian manuscripts were written on a codex during that time. So Christianity was kind of ahead of the curve as far as